Well, Genesis 39 is where we are this morning as we continue this sermon series looking at the life of Joseph. And I just encourage you, like last week, to just camp in this passage or this book in the Bible here, this chapter, because I won't read it in its entirety. I'll just read it through sections throughout the 30 minutes. So make sure and stay there throughout the message. And this is what I'll probably do throughout this series, as it's a long narrative and long, lengthy chapters as we go into the life of Joseph. So I'll begin by looking at Genesis 39, verses 1 through 6. This is God's holy and inspired word. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he had made him overseer in his house and all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. So we'll stop there. Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of mockers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. As we journey through this chapter, we're going to see Joseph go through three things or three phases. He'll go first from from slavery to success. Then he'll go from authority to a false accusation. And then he'll go from prison to power. So the first 6 verses describe how Joseph went from slavery to success. And just to bring you update from last week, we know that Joseph, he was beaten up by his older brothers and then thrown into a cistern to die. And then a caravan was traveling through this town of Dothan to Egypt. And his older brother Judah got the idea to, instead of leaving Joseph there in the pit to die, to sell Joseph to this caravan that were on their way to Egypt. And so he sold Joseph for 20 shekels, and Joseph was now in slavery. He was in bondage. He was held captive by this foreign group that was traveling to Egypt. And we don't know quite how long the travel was and how long he was in slavery, but it may not have been that long, because when they got to Egypt, verse 1 tells us, Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. What we know here is that the moment that Joseph got to Egypt, there was a man named Potiphar who came, and he saw all of these slaves for sale. And he looked at Joseph, and something stood out to him about Joseph. And so he spent money to buy Joseph from this Ishmaelite, Midianite group. And this is now the second time that Joseph had been sold and bought by someone. And this time it was by a man who worked for Pharaoh, the Egyptian leader of the time. And Potiphar, you may not know this, but Jewish historians, they title Potiphar as the chief of execution, in the sense of he was the chief executioner, in that he not only was a guard for Pharaoh, but he was known to promote orders to execute people for capital punishment. And that's going to be important as we continue on this chapter, because you need to remember that and tuck that away. Potiphar was known as that. He was a very skilled military man, almost like a general in today's terms. And he was one of Pharaoh's right-hand men who would help him leading the army. And Potiphar saw something special in Joseph, so he bought him. And we know that he was impressed with Joseph because Joseph started in verse 2 as an indoor servant, and then he became Potiphar's personal attendant, the overseer of the land and his house. The word oversee is fascinating, because when you study the Hebrew text of Joshua and Moses, you'll find that same word that describes the relationship between Joshua and Moses. It was a very intimate, close relationship that Joshua and Moses had. And now we see that very same word described as Joseph and Potiphar's relationship. They had a very close and intimate relationship, enough to where Potiphar had so much trust in Joseph that he gave everything under Joseph's charge. And we know that whatever Joseph touched, it just simply got better. Verse 2 described how the Lord was with Joseph. He became a successful man. He was in the house of his Egyptian master. So the reason why Joseph was so successful and everything he touched got better was because the Lord was with him. The Lord gave him success. And Joseph, yes, he obviously had skills as a manager, as a supervisor, as whatever trade it was at that time. He was able to climb the company ladder so quickly, we know from verses 2 through 4. But the sole reason why Joseph was able to climb the company ladder was because God was with him and God gave him success. We see this again from verses 3 through 5. His master saw the Lord was with him and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. What I want you to notice is something really profound here in these verses. Even a pagan master, a pagan officer, he could see the blessing that God had on Joseph. So even a non-believer who believed in many gods, the Egyptians believed in multiple gods, they were polytheists, they believed in many gods. He even noticed something different about Joseph, and he even was able to see that Joseph's God, our God, made him different than the rest of the workers. You see, Potiphar was reaping the benefits of having Joseph on his team. He was reaping the benefits of having Joseph on his team. And whatever Joseph did prospered. As I thought about this example, I thought about what we're reading this year as a congregation. We're going through the book of Psalms in our call to worship. And if you didn't pick up one of those packets, please do so on your way out and journey through the Psalms with us. And the Psalm 1 that we read this week, it describes in verse 3 that blessed is the man who is like a tree planted by streams of water, that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. And all that he does, whatever he does, he prospers. He succeeds in whatever he does because his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. The Psalm 1 man made me think of Joseph here, in that whatever Joseph did prospered. It got better. He was successful. And as I thought about Joseph in this setting, here he was a slave, and now he's in a foreign land working for a man he doesn't barely know, a non-believer. He made things better. He was salt and light in a dark world. And as I thought about Joseph, I couldn't help but think about us. Wherever Christians go, we should see things improve. Things should get better because of Christians, plain and simple. And the reason I say that is, what does the Bible teach about Christianity? It teaches that we are to be people of humility. We are to be people who are disciplined, hardworking. We are to be people who are respectable to others. We are to be people who show love and grace towards other people. We are to be people who are good stewards with finances, or good stewards with our bodies, or good stewards with what God has given us. And so again, the key here is wherever Christians are, things should improve. And I like what Matthew Henry said. He said, good men are the blessings of the places where they live. Good men and good women are the blessing of the places where they live. And one way that you can see growth in yourself, one way that you can identify that you are growing in your faith and as a Christian, is if you're bringing blessing to others. If you're bringing blessing to others. So my question to you this morning is, are you personally making your corner of the world a better place? Are you personally, like Joseph, making your corner of the world a better place? And if you can't answer that question, I want to challenge you to really dig deep and think about how you can personally impact your corner of the world. Because we all have corners that God has placed us in. It could literally be in a cul-de-sac. And you get to know your neighbors. We live in a cul-de-sac and we've gotten to know our neighbors in our cul-de-sac. We don't know the whole neighborhood, but we've got to know our neighbors in the cul-de-sac. So where is your corner? It might be a student in a public school. You're light in a public school. They need Christians in the public school. It could be that you're playing on a sports team as a kid. You might be homeschool or Christian school, but I would encourage you to play on a sports team where you get to be around non-believers and really be a light to those teammates that you're with. It could be your career choice. You might be in a world filled with non-believers. That might be your corner where you can be salt and light. It could be your neighborhood, literally, where you live. So where is your corner and how are things improving because of your presence? Because of your presence. And that's what Christianity does. Think about if Christians were pulled away from everything. If Christians weren't in business or weren't in education or weren't in engineering, how would things look? Politics. How would things be if we just isolated ourselves? Things would get a lot worse, right? And so just as we see with Joseph impacting his world, so we are called to impact the world for the glory of God and for the good of others. Things were looking up for Joseph because God gave him success. And it got so good that verse 6 says, he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. You know what this tells me? Is that Potiphar and Joseph were so close that Joseph could almost finish his sentences. They were so close that the only decision Potiphar had to make was what meal he was gonna have next, where he was gonna eat and what he was gonna eat. Now you talk about trust, you talk about loyalty. Joseph gained that trust, he gained that respect, he gained that loyalty because of day in and day out hard work and being consistent and faithful to his leader, to his supervisor. But just as things started looking up for Joseph, we see yet again another heart-wrenching setback take place. Joseph next plunges into another downward spiral and goes from having this position of authority to then having a false accusation and even allegation made against him. So let's go back to the text here, Genesis 39, verse 6, part B of verse 6. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. When you read that, you think, uh-oh. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he's put everything that he has in my charge. He's not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her to lie beside her or to be with her. But one day when he went into the house to do his work and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment saying, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, see, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came into me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home, and she told him the same story, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house. As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, this is the way your servant treated me, his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. As we see here, first, Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And when you read that, you think, uh-oh, what's next? And I say that because another passage in the Old Testament made me think of Absalom, David's son, one of David's sons. Absalom was also described as beautiful and handsome and finally appeared. And when you think about Absalom, what did he do with that good looks? He used it to his advantage in a negative way. He turned prideful and ended up making horrible decisions. And so often people who are good looking, so often people who are popular, they end up falling flat on their face because they spend so much of their time thinking about their outward appearance, and it turns to pride. But with Joseph, we don't see that happening. With Absalom, we did, but with Joseph, we didn't see that happening. We see that his beauty was not simply skin deep. His beauty also characterized his soul. And here we see Potiphar, the man that he was closely related to or with and work. They saw each other every day, working very close. We see the one thing that Potiphar didn't give Joseph to oversee was his wife. And that one thing came to Joseph and said, lie with me. And notice the 35 words in Hebrew that Joseph said to her. Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He's not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you're his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? What I love about Joseph's response here is he says a couple things. First, he said, I've been given this trust, and if I do this atrocious thing, I'll lose that trust and that credibility. The second thing he says is his relationship with Potiphar. He was loyal to Potiphar. How could I do this? But the most important thing Joseph mentioned in this response is he said, this was a wicked thing. How could I sin against God by lying with you, a married woman? How could I do it? And right here we see the true character of Joseph play out. We see where his true loyalty lies. His true loyalty lies not in Potiphar, but in the Lord. And he knew very well that to be with another man's woman was against God's will and his word. He knew that to be with a woman before marriage was against God's will and God's word. And so that's why he was able to say no. But yet this woman was very persistent, wasn't she? Verse 10 says, she spoke to Joseph day after day, but yet he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. Anytime you're in a position of leadership, you're gonna get a big target on your back. Joseph was in a prime position of leadership, and he had a big target on his back. So keep that in mind, leaders out there. But the other thing I want you to think about is, I want you to think about Joseph in this situation. All the challenges that this young man was facing. Okay, he was sold by his brothers into slavery. He's now by himself, and he's living in a foreign country, miles and miles away from his homeland, doesn't know a single soul other than the people he's working with. He's living in a foreign land that their values are far different than his values. No one would have ever known. He's anonymous. He's single. And I would imagine in his 20s, his hormones were raging. Had never probably been with a woman before. And his opportunity is here. Think about the challenges that this young man was facing. And here is an aggressive woman coming after him. Now, this woman was probably beautiful. And she is probably making promises to him that if you do these things, I will reward you with this. But yet, Joseph, he was able to say, no, 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 no. It reminds me of Proverbs chapter 7. As we seek to have wisdom from God, we say to wisdom, you're my sister, and call insight your intimate friend to keep you from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words. Joseph showed incredible restraint and self-control. He showed incredible wisdom by not allowing the smooth talk of the adulterous woman to grab a hold of him. But here we see that the temptation got even more intense. Again, Joseph could have said, nobody's looking. No one will ever know. I'll be rewarded if I do this. Things might get better for me. And the temptation gets even stronger for him. Verse 11, One day when he went into the house to do his work and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. This time, no one literally was around. And I want to say this for application's sake. The risk of giving in to temptation becomes greater in cases of isolation. Not only as leaders, you get a target on your back, but the risk of giving in to temptation becomes greater in cases of isolation. And not only in isolation is temptation greater, but the tempter usually will turn up the heat after being rejected a few times. This woman kept getting rejected and she's turning up the heat saying, you don't reject me, I'm used to getting whatever I want. You don't reject me, this is becoming more of a challenge. So I'm gonna do whatever it takes to get this guy. And as I thought about Potiphar's wife, I couldn't help but think of Satan in the wilderness with Jesus. Remember when Jesus was alone? What did Satan the tempter do to him? He turned up the heat each time he tempted Jesus. He turned up the heat. I'll give you food. And then he said, I'll give you the world. I mean, think about how Satan gave him all these empty promises, turning up the reward to make things seem better. But Jesus was able to run away from the tempter. Now, Joseph, he would have been wearing the typical garment of the day. You may not know this. I didn't know this till this week. He would have been wearing a long sleeve shirt and shorts that came to his mid-calf. So this long sleeve shirt would have been pretty big on him. So it would have taken her to be very aggressive to pull this shirt off him. He didn't just hand it to her. Like she must have wrestled and pulled this off him. But yet what I love about what Matthew Henry said in this case, he said, it's better to lose a good coat than to lose a good conscience. It's better to lose a good coat than to lose a good conscience. And what did Joseph do? He said, take my coat. I don't need that. I'm not fighting with you anymore. I'm out of here. And he ran. He took off. He got out of there. And when you think about temptation, it can come in many forms, especially when you're alone. You could be thinking that bad thought. You could be looking at that thing you shouldn't be looking at. You could be talking to that person you shouldn't be talking to. When those things happen, run. Run. It makes me think of 1 Corinthians 6, flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. 2 Timothy 2, flee youthful passions and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace along with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. Flee, run, go, get out of there. Now, before you're placed in a situation, the only thing I would say that Joseph did wrong here, but we don't really know the whole context, so he may not have done anything wrong. He probably didn't know he was in this room alone with her. He probably didn't know that. But the one thing I would say here is don't put yourself in that kind of situation. Don't put yourself in that kind of situation. It's called the Billy Graham rule, if you've ever heard of that. Billy Graham used to have this rule that he would never go to lunch with a woman that wasn't his wife. He would never travel alone with another woman that wasn't his wife or his daughters. He would never even get on an elevator by himself without that. So what is your Billy Graham rule, men and women? What is your Billy Graham rule? Be very, very cautious and careful. Because here's the thing, a lot can happen in those situations. Not only could you give in to temptation and make a horrible decision, but there could be a situation of rape. There also could be a situation of accusation. And in this world, those things happen. Those things happen. And so be sure to not put yourself in a compromising situation and never let your hand get near the cookie jar. You know what I mean? Never let your hand get near that cookie jar. And what I love about Joseph is he ran even when she took that garment away. And when she went on, she called to the men of her household and said to them, see, he's brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came into me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and he fled and got out of the house. There's a famous statement that says, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. This woman was scorned. She was rejected. And so she brought rage upon Joseph. And how did she do it? She said, I've got circumstantial evidence. He left his garment. He was trying to make a pass at me. He made a move on me and he left his garment. Here's his garment. And this is now the second time we see that Joseph had circumstantial evidence used against him. You think about the first one, the coat of many colors, that was evidence to his father saying, hey, Joseph's dead. And now the second time, another coat, but this time a garment, where another woman is saying, or another person saying, oh, here's some circumstantial evidence that Joseph made a pass at me. But notice what Potiphar's wife did here. She put the blame on her husband. She blamed her husband. She laid up his garment by her until his master came, and she told him the same story. The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came into me to laugh at me. This Hebrew servant that you brought among us, Potiphar. You see, she's putting the blame on her husband. You know what she's doing? She's saying, I'm not responsible at all. In fact, I'm going to put all the ownership on my husband who brought this guy in the first place. So that keeps me completely out of the picture. So now not only is it Joseph's fault, but it's also Potiphar's fault for bringing this man here. So she's completely distancing herself from any kind of trouble, saying that her husband brought the trouble on the situation. But what I want you to notice is verse 19, Potiphar's reaction. As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, this is the way your servant treated me, his anger was kindled, and Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. What I want you to notice here, and this is what all the scholars I read said, they said that Potiphar was a chief executioner. He was used to putting people on death row and killing them or having them killed. Wouldn't you think this would be the prime opportunity for Potiphar to execute Joseph? I mean, after all, Joseph sinned against him by trying to make a pass at his own wife. But what most scholars would say is that right here, Potiphar may not have trusted his wife because he should have executed Joseph. But instead, he saved face because he had to do something, and he put Joseph in prison. After all, Joseph and Potiphar were very close, probably for many years. One scholar said they were together for 11 years. And so Potiphar is probably also thinking of his wife's track record, and she probably made these kind of decisions often because Egypt was a pretty wild and sexualized culture. So Potiphar very well may not have trusted his wife, and he could have just been angry at the situation because it didn't say he was angry at Joseph. But I would conclude there was some anger there, regardless. And he threw Joseph in prison. And so here Joseph is once again at a low point, another heart-wrenching turn of events. And now he's in prison after this false accusation made against him. So let's finish the chapter, verse 21 through 23. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. There's two things I want to close with here about Joseph that stood out to me. Joseph went from prison to power. He was imprisoned, and now he has influence yet again. Wherever Joseph was, wherever God had Joseph, Joseph gave it his all. He worked with all that he had. He gave glory in whatever situation he was in. So whether he was a shepherd boy attending his father, whether he was a slave, whether he was working in an Egyptian's guard's house, or whether he's in prison, Joseph worked as hard as he could, and he made the most of every situation that he was in. There was no job that was too menial or too low for him to apply his energy. And as I thought about Joseph, I thought about us, and I thought about Colossians 3. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men. Joseph worked heartily. He gave it his all in whatever he was doing, and he was working for the Lord and not for man. And that's why God made him successful. God was with him. And Joseph worked in whatever situation he was in for the glory of God. You can be cleaning toilets for the glory of God. As you make your bed each morning, you're doing it for God's glory. As you're cleaning your house, you're doing it for God's glory. As you're cooking a meal day after day after day for your kids and cleaning those dishes, you could do it for God's glory. Work heartily for the Lord and not for man. The second thing that impressed me about Joseph is that God was with Joseph when he was in the pit. God was with Joseph when he was in a slave caravan. He was with Joseph when he was tempted by a woman of a high position, and he was with Joseph now in prison. And just as God was with Joseph at his low points and at his high points, he's with you. He's with you at your low points when you're in a pit, when you're tempted. He's with you. He'll provide a way out. If you give in to temptation, he's with you. He'll forgive you. Let's try this again. And he's with you even in your high points in life. Joshua 1:9, have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous, do not be frightened, do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Let's pray.